All right, well, we are in Proverbs tonight, and we have studied all but we have two of the main topics left. And so we'll discuss um, riches and treasures tonight, and that may carry into next week. So I said we might be done next week, but we'll probably have one more because I want to do one more message on righteousness and integrity, okay? So it'll probably be maybe another week or two before we're done here, but excuse me. But tonight we deal with one of the major themes, the major six themes of riches and possessions, okay? And so the book of Proverbs gives a great deal of attention to the idea of possessions and wealth, and not just wealth, but earthly treasures and earthly possessions. So most of you know, my dad is a preacher, and growing up, he was an itinerant preacher. So traveling evangelists aren't as much a thing as they used to be, and they've taken on various forms. But Dad was an evangelist, and so we lived in a travel trailer that we bought here in Elkhart, and we traveled around. That was my life. I mean, I grew up in my bedroom was tiny. When I hear kids complain about not having toys, it's like, dude, our bedroom was tiny. We had a bunk bed at the end, and often the entirety of our floor was covered in Legos, right? Because that was a good storage toy, and so we had Legos. The entirety of the kitchen floor was often covered in Legos, and my mom was so gracious. But there were certain things we couldn't do in the trailer growing up. We had to minimize. When we became teenagers, we weren't allowed to wrestle anymore. Early teenagers. My brother was 13 when we came off the road. I was 11, so we were almost in middle school. But because the trailer would rock when we wrestled, the whole thing would rock back and forth. And anyway, so that's how I grew up. And so as early as I can remember, I remember my dad preaching. And one of my dad's preaching heroes was a traveling evangelist in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And his name was Monroe Parker, okay? And Monroe Parker's a fascinating individual. He was a boxer. He's just a really fascinating man, incredibly physically strong. And one of his famous lines that I remember my dad saying every week that he preached this sermon was, you'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. And I think there's various iterations of that, right? You'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. Maybe you've seen that old, I think it's the Jimmy Stewart movie. Maybe you've seen that old Jimmy Stewart movie, You Can't Take It With You. Anyone ever seen that one? Okay, it's pretty funny. It's a good one. You get the idea that I'm moving towards. Proverbs fundamentally is going to remind us of the wisdom of not living to accumulate resources here. It will encourage the accumulation of resources for wise purposes, but it will not encourage the accumulation of resources for resources' sake. Which, when we think about it in terms like that, I actually think this topic, the way that Proverbs addresses it, is massively needed for our culture in particular. Okay? And our culture in particular seems to treat wealth and the pursuit of wealth as a recreation, not just an opportunity, but something that should be done by everybody, listen, for its own sake. Grow to be wealthy and fill your garage with toys just because wealth is good. And so the ongoing pattern and cycle of the pursuit of wealth for its own sake is, and again, I'm a patriot, I'm thankful for our country, is a distinctly American idea. Okay? Now, I say distinctly American. We see iterations of it throughout history. However, we live in a culture, where we're better off than most people. And so we just naturally believe that what we need to do next is to be better off than where we are now. And what Proverbs is actually going to do is it's going to say, we're not going to say wisdom, we're not going to say resources, and we're not even going to say wealth is bad. We're going to say, how can we think about those things wisely and with an eternal. And Lord, I ask that you would give us spiritual understanding. And I ask that you would help us to see things the way that the Scriptures want us to hear, that we would have a long-term perspective for what you give us in this life. And I ask these things through Christ. Amen. I do think before we read these passages and get into it, I do think it is worth saying that when Solomon talks about wealth, he's talking about those who are experiencing the exception. Okay? And so I do think that there's a particular temptation that you and I have to categorize and, class ourselves on the basis of wealth. Yet I do think that we should understand that probably God, in the culture in which we live and just the various number of resources that we have distinct temptations for the pursuit of wealth. And so I think we need to come to this humbly, and we really need to ask ourselves, do I think about my money and do I think about my toys in my garage, because, or not the garage, wherever? Do I think about them biblically? Do I actually have godly categories for how I evaluate the resources and treasures in my life? And that's what we hope to do with this passage, or these passages. The first thing I want to point out from Proverbs is the foundation that we see, the fundamental, I'm going to call it the prime pursuit. Okay, that's, if you were taking notes, that's not quite the point that I would give you. But the prime pursuit for truly wise people are the riches of righteousness, not the riches of resources. Okay, so if you were to summarize a perspective of riches from Proverbs, it would be a statement like that. Okay, the prime pursuit for godly people, for wise people, are the riches of righteousness, not the riches of resources. And it is that foundation, that the riches of resources. So if you're taking notes, that's probably our first main heading. The riches of righteousness. That's the foundation that Proverbs continually goes back to when it comes to how do we think about wealth. Proverbs 10:23, treasures gained by wickedness do not profit. Treasures gained by wickedness do not profit. Now that seems like a counterintuitive idea, right? Because you would think that treasures just naturally profit. That's the nature of treasures. They are a profit, or they do profit. But again, we're drawn back to a long-term perspective. Proverbs is going to draw attention to the end game, right? Antithetical parallelism, contrast presented. Treasures gained by wickedness do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. Okay? So the long term here is that righteousness is better for your life than riches or treasures or resources, especially gained in, maybe we use the term dodgy methods. Again, same verse 3, excuse me. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry. God provides for people who pursue the right things. God provides for those engaged in the prime pursuit. And what's the prime pursuit? The riches of righteousness, not the riches of resources. Proverbs 11:4. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath. You will not see a U-Haul behind a hearse. You can't take it with you. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath. But righteousness delivers from death. Remember, one of the things that we said a long time ago about Proverbs is that there's a spiritual blessing typically coupled with a physical blessing. This is the way that we invite God's peace into our hearts and lives, or live out that peace, to live God's way. And to live outside of God's wisdom is to invite conflict into our life, to invite tension into our life. So if we put it in this context, to live outside of the way that God wants us to think about resources and money and treasures, to live outside of that is going to invite the natural stresses that come with money. And that is, I was about to say that's true of the rich too, but you might say it's especially true of the rich. I was listening to a podcast just a few weeks ago, and it is not a Christian podcast, okay? It's not a Christian podcast. And the host is, I think he's worth like $300 million or something. And he says, man, the more money you get, the more stress you have in life. He's just shooting straight. The more money you get, the more stress you have in life. Now, that's an unbeliever talking. That's someone who doesn't have these categories. I certainly don't want to context rip the writer of Ecclesiastes, which I happen to believe is Solomon. Okay, but actually, he says something very similar. I was about to say, sometimes I wonder if the principle where he says, as you increase in knowledge, you increase in sorrow is true of money. But actually, he says that in Ecclesiastes. I can't remember exactly how he says it, but principally, he communicates that idea. The more treasure you gain for yourself here, you might just be accumulating proportionate tension. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. The value, the prime pursuit of righteousness in chapter 11, verse 16. A gracious woman gets honor, and violent men get riches. Which would you rather have? There'd be times when the riches would be nice, right? How many of you have ever driven your car off the lot? Like out of the mechanic. You've driven your car out of the shop, not the lot. Hopefully it's not off the lot. Maybe that's happened to you too. But you've driven your car away from the shop, and the next day you heard another sound. How many does it happen to you? You're like, you know what? Maybe the Amish are right. Like maybe we should just all go horse and buggy, right? Then you have different problems, I guess, but wouldn't it be nice in those times when you're just one car trouble after the next? Some riches would be nice. A gracious woman gets honor and violent men get riches. Which would you rather have? Because the return on investment for honor is invaluable. But the stress and danger of riches gotten the wrong way is calculable. I love this verse, 16:8, perspective check. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. 28:6, better is a poor man who walks in integrity than a rich man who is crooked in his ways. Who would you rather be? 28:20, a faithful man will abound in blessings. A faithful man will abound in blessings. Now here's where we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we think blessings are? Because the contrast is specific, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. So do we think blessings are riches? Now, sometimes they are. The answer to that, if it's from God's hand, is yes. Right? But not if they're from ill-gotten gains, not if they're done poorly, if they're attained poorly. If our prime pursuit is riches and resources rather than righteousness, it will bring with it natural consequences. So what's your pursuit tonight? Would you rather have money and risk the potential consequences than righteousness and honor, where you can be certain there will only be positive consequences? There will only be true blessings from His hand. And is your perspective of blessing a biblical one? Because if you're gathered here tonight, and you are, as a professing, growing, sanctified believer, and I don't have any reason to believe you are otherwise, you are rich. And you are rich, and we are rich in ways that the world not only does not understand, but they don't know that they crave. We are immeasurably rich with grace poured out upon us in Christ. Remember Ephesians 1? He has made us rich with grace out of the stores, out of the riches of His grace. The riches of His grace with which He has made us rich. That's blessing, loved ones. The community of faith where we care for one another and encourage one another and care about one another's souls, and we treat the condition of the soul, maybe with a check or a DoorDash gift card or something. Maybe there's a resource connected to that. But beyond that, where we give spiritual gifts of encouragement and exhortation and service and administration, in here, represented right here, and teenagers downstairs, and children in their rooms, and what we experienced this morning, that's richness. That's blessing from God's hand. The richness of family. Even when it's a little bit disrupted, because I heard one person say one time, every family is a little bit dysfunctional. It's just a matter of how, right? Even if it's a little bit disrupted, because remember, we don't live in the ideal. Remember, we're trying to get back to the, scholars use the term Edenic ideal. Eden, we're trying to get back there where everything's perfect pre-sin, and we will one day. But family's disrupted. Even in a disrupted family, there's blessing there. The love of your children, the admiration of your grandchildren. Is there any richness that can go into account or your wallet or sit on your mantle or in your garage? Is there any richness like that? So the prime pursuit is the riches of righteousness, not the riches of resource. Secondly, I think that we see in Proverbs this prime pursuit coupled with the wealth not from work necessarily, but of work. So there's the wealth that we receive from work, but actually the way that we see it in Proverbs is that the work itself maintains value. These passages highlight the value of diligent labor. Proverbs 13:11, wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase in it. Now again, this is where I want you to understand. There are an abundance of warnings regarding wealth in Scripture. Christ himself is going to do this, all right? But the warnings are related to the inherent temptation towards self-dependence. Okay? So you think of the rich young ruler. Jesus pushes on his treasures, not just his righteousness. He pushes on the treasure of his heart. Go sell everything you have. And what Jesus is doing is he's pressing on what actually is this young man's master. When he says it's easier for the camel to go through the eye of the needle than for the rich man to see the kingdom, he's not saying, riches are naturally destructive. What he's saying is there's an inherent temptation towards self-dependence. And what Solomon is going to do is he's going to detach that temptation towards self-dependence by teaching patience and true value associated with wealth. Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers it little by little will increase it. And this is not to be overly depressing or just to use a low-hanging fruit illustration, but have you read statistics on those who win the lottery? It's not good. Bankruptcy and suicide are through the roof. Why? Because people typically, without categories like this, aren't equipped to go from nothing to everything or from very little to a lot. Why? Because when humans are presented with the opportunity to have the life that we think we've always wanted, distinct from biblical categories, and depend on ourselves, we will destroy ourselves. So what Proverbs is going to do is Solomon is going to cause us to distrust wealth gained without work. The quick, easy, cheap way. We read this when we were talking about hard work. 14:23, in toil there is profit. In toil there is profit. It's worth the hard work. But talk tends only to poverty. 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance. And I think this is a really practical verse. The plans of the diligent. Diligent people plan. They have categories for what they intend to do with their money and their resources, and they stick to it. But everyone who is hasty comes to poverty. They act quickly, they think quickly, they just do, they don't plan. Poverty follows that. I love this passage in 27, 23, and 24. It has the idea of stewardship and the accumulation that comes with stewardship. Know well the condition of your flock and give attention to your herds, for riches do not last forever. and a crown is not secure for all generations. So what is he saying? Work hard, steward your resources, because you cannot count. You cannot count on the stability of money. And you're not absolutely sure of that crown for all generations. So, and I don't mean to be trite, this is biblical wisdom. Of all people who should really distrust get-rich-quick programs, it should be Christians. But of all people who seem to be duped by it, it's millions of professing Christians who tune in to every channel, to that channel every Sunday, where the big smiling guy with the $3,000 suit tells them, if you just send in $20, you'll get 60. And I got to watch myself. But the irony of this, the sad irony of this, it's like, have you people read Proverbs? It literally says, don't trust money gotten quickly without work. Don't trust yourself. But these wolves have figured out, if we just give them false promises in a true God's name, they will eat it up. God have mercy on their souls. So we note the prime pursuit is the wealth of work. Or the prime pursuit is the pursuit of righteousness over resources. And the path to that pursuit is work and the wealth that accompanies it. What truly is the treasure of your heart? And are we willing to be faithful to think about our resources God's way? I don't know how many of you all know the name Peter Waldo. So Peter Waldo was a Frenchman who lived in the 12th and 13th century. Maybe you've heard of the Waldensians. Okay, so Peter Waldo was the founder of the Waldensians. Peter Waldo was a merchant. He was a very wealthy merchant in Lyon, France. Okay, so most people think that he was a silk trader. He'd done very well, had a very large estate. You can still find his plantation and statues of him in France, because he's a very important individual now, to us, not to most French people, unfortunately. But in his early adult life, he went to the priests, and he says, how can a man be righteous before God? And of course, the priest told him what the priests would always say. Just do all the Catholic stuff and give money to the church. Because Waldo had it. Waldo had it extensively. But he was unsatisfied by this. It was when he was reading the text of the rich young ruler, the Spirit began to draw his heart. And then actually, Waldo was having dinner with friends, and one of his friends passed over dead at the dinner table. And it caused an intense pursuit after spiritual things in Waldo's life. He professed Christ and began to preach the gospel with training. He began to preach the gospel. He became a lay preacher. And he used his wealth to have books of the Bible translated. It was incredibly expensive to have print work done and book work done at this time, but he used his wealth to have books of the Bible, certain Gospels, New Testament books, translated, which got the attention of the Catholic Church, because they really didn't like the people having the Bible. Because if the people had the Bible, then they didn't have to listen to the Pope and the priests. Okay? So then the Catholic Church came to Waldo and said that you have to stop preaching, and he said, no, I'm going to keep preaching, and he did. But he took a group of men out into the mountains of France, and they called themselves the Poor Men of Lyon. And Waldo would fund these men to go out and preach and give money to the poor. It was Waldo's goal in life to end with very little, having given all of it away for the sake of the kingdom. The foundation that he built, using his resources, using his money that he had earned and worked hard for, the foundation that he built laid the foundation for men like John Wycliffe, who would become the morning star of the Reformation and use Waldo's model for the interpretation of the Bible. Here's a man who was not raised in a godly home, worked hard for money, said, I'm going to give it all back. And 300 and something years later, when Luther would begin, when the Reformation would begin, the Waldensians found the Protestants, and they unified in the mission of Protestantism. Hundreds of years after Waldo died. Money invested the right way has eternal ramifications. Now, God may not call you to use your wealth in that way, but God has called us to think about our resources wisely and spiritually, and to give them back to Him in the way that He calls us and guides us to do so. And we may never know the return on that spiritual investment. Would you pray with me?